right, so yes, it's upgrade season. Now that we're in SP2, at least at minimum, there's lots of patches out as well. You know, we're in the season of support's ending, and definitely SPO2 has got all the bells and whistles. So everything's been moved in, and there's not waiting on a lot of things, and so they've made a lot of fixes. So it's kind of the safe space of upgrade season. So I'm going to start out with just the general upgrade, considerations, because certainly if you are new to upgrading a business objects environment, there's a lot of general things to consider. And so it wouldn't be fair to start a presentation without some of the general upgrade concepts. But then I'll dive into SP02 because there's some special things. And when we get, and I don't have enough time to even cover all the special things, so we're gonna have a part 2. Okay. So this is a session overview. I'm gonna talk about the generals, and then I'm gonna kind of get into some other pieces. So as far as general planning goes, as far as general planning goes, we did a presentation in the AZ Boat group, and I compared my top 10 trip advice for a car trip across the US with the top 10 recommendations when upgrading, or things to think about when upgrading. I'm not going to go through all that, but I do think it's important to point out that these are the kinds of things that you want to think about just in general. So is your environment growing? Do you need to increase licensing? Do you need to look at, reducing your licensing or changing to a cloud environment, partial, with your internal, or are you starting in the dashboarding, or are you trying to go to a push-pull method? All these things are things to think about, things to consider. Are you changing? Are you deciding you want more redundancy? So you have, 2 web servers, so you have that kind of thing. I mean, those are kinds of things that are, now's a good time to consider, because if you're doing a migration from one environment to another environment of your content, then, you can make those changes seamlessly. So this is a great time to consider that. Also, of course, moving content from one area to another, you want to consider the less amount of content you have to move and test, the better. So now is a good time to do some archiving and cleaning up. I'm actually going to do a presentation at IBIS for a big project that we've done with a team, and for moving documents into an archive folder, and then purging those documents, and then running them through an archive LCMBR file. To archive them off. So the process of how you might do that, including reporting out to your users with a CMS and audit database use. You can report out to your users, here's what you haven't touched for 2 years. So we recommend you archive these, and then they have a chance to just open up the document, and then they've created an event in the audit log, and we know that they've created a view event, and so that object gets off the recommended to archive list. So great time to do that. We could talk more about that project at another time, but this is a good time to do that. Also, of course, setting limits. For a long time now, of course, we can set limits on favorites and public folders, limits being what the number of instances that you create and keep when you schedule. So if you schedule and you have a history, you'd have, if you set it to 50, then after 51 comes, then the oldest one gets removed, and that kind of thing. So you can limit by time or by number. So you can also limit it if it's over 2 years old. So those are all things to consider as far as changes that are good to make at a time that you're doing an upgrade, because changing it all at once. Just general management, it's a good time to consider how that's going to maybe applying a new method for data management. It's good to get your requests for SSL, load balancer in early. A lot of those things take a while for different outside teams. So anything associated with an outside team, get those requests in upfront so that they get returned back in a timely manner, and you can move on to other things. Avoid traps, things that are known faults. So rather than as you go into it, look for the list of known issues. For example, we'll tell you some of the things that you can avoid. Follow guides. So there's, of course, an installation guide. There's the admin guide, but there's also a lot of blogs that are available out there. And especially if you're moving to something new, you're going to get more up-to-date information from a blog entry than you might from the PDF guide. So those are the kinds of things you want to think about and look for. Use past experience. So most of you have had business objects for a long time, and there should be some documentation from the past. And for example, a client of mine had a client, or has, their customers were upset at the previous migration because they are used to getting their documents from the recent documents list that comes up on their first page, so, or on their homepage. Well, that went away in a migration, so we wanted to address that this time around. So those are the kinds of things that we want to look at and address. Introduce new goodies. So this is a good time to bolster your presence as a business objects environment, because there's lots of good new goodies. And so the idea of introducing them to your users can bring in user acceptance and use. So this is a good time to do that. And then when you document all the changes that you've made, all the customization you've made, look at the previous documentation and see what needs to be applied. For example, now that SAML is so easy, there's not a need to do things like a redirect from another web location. So there's some options that you would maybe do differently, but it's good to kind of say why you do them differently. I did it in the last upgrade like this. I'm doing it like this time because this decision was made for this reason, because all that kind of why information can easily fall away. Plan for training. So this is one of the big ones in the 4.3 environment. You want to plan definitely for a fair amount of training for your developers. Your front end screen, of course, is changed. So there's also the possibility that you want to introduce just the portal itself to users that are just pulling data, but definitely any of your developers are going to want web intelligence training. Even your administrators, there are some things that have changed, and it's a good time to do like a change type of training for that. Okay, so that's just the general thing. And like I said before, I compared it to a trip across the United States, but maybe I'll do that presentation at a different time. Okay, so the next topic I want to say is getting into that service pack 2, as opposed to just in general, upgrading in general. So whenever you do an upgrade, one of the major things that you want to look at is what's supported now. What are the background applications that are currently supported? And that's all in the PAM guide. And I provide a link here, but really you can just Google Business Objects 4.3 PAM and you'll find it. If it's 4.2, you can do 4.2 PAM, that kind of thing. It's pretty easy to find. But it's an important thing to look at. And there's a lot of things that I want to just kind of call out that are in the PAM that are things that you might, consider. So if you have something that's, a 2008 server, it's no longer supported. So you want to kind of keep in mind that that you might have to upgrade. R2 2012 though is still supported. A lot of people are moving to Windows 2019. Another big piece of the operating system entries that you'll see in the PAM is that Linux and Unix is no longer supported for crystal reports as of SP2. So 4.3.1 did, but now the recommendation is to move to a Windows operating system. Desktop Windows, those have a certain level. What's a thing to call out is that client tools are now all 64-bit, so you don't need 32-bit clients unless you're going to something else that's 32-bit, like an Excel spreadsheet or something. So there's certain things that you don't need, so 64-bit is the way to go. And that's a real big plus for most of us administrators. We're like, yay, one data type instead of 32 and 64, trying to put them on the same machine. Hooray. Browsers.
So a quick question. A quick
Yeah,
question, Amy. Is Windows 11 not supported yet for BI 4.3 SP2?
Windows 11. Oh, there is a separate guide. There's a knowledge base guide on that. And it depends on the patch level, I think. But there is a knowledge base guide. I didn't throw it in here, but if whoever has the question wants to post their name, I can send over that knowledge base entry. But yeah, it's I can't remember if it's supported, but I know there's a knowledge base entry because I did look it up for somebody else, but I can't remember.
It's Astrid. You can drop her a note.
Ah, yes, yeah, I can send that on over. Okay, so other things to consider, of course, IE 11. So when it comes down to browsers that you'd also see in the PAM guide, IE 11 in general, this is not to do with business objects, but it's losing Microsoft support. So you might want to then come off of that, and then you're going to have to look at what's, what else is supported as far as business objects. So of course, Edge, Chrome, and Safari 13 on the Mac. Firefox, go away. Firefox is losing support. This is an interesting one because I know a lot of people that are still using it, and I haven't seen any problem with it. But in terms of support, SAP is reporting that they're no longer supporting it. So I'm not sure what doesn't work on it, to be honest with you, because I've done installs and had it work. So still looking into that. Web app server, of course, is Tomcat 9. One of the things to call out here is that WebSphere is losing support. So if you're a WebSphere shop, something to consider. These are all things, of course, that you want to know ahead of time. So it's part of your planning. CMS audit databases, different from your reporting databases. So there's always requirements that are separate between the two. So when you're accessing your CMS or audit database, there are specific drivers that you're supposed to use in order to access those versions of your CMS and audit databases. So specifically calling out if your SQL Server, these are the versions that are supported, but if it's 14, 16, or 17, it's not the native SQL that you would use, it's the Microsoft ODBC driver 13. And if you're on SQL Server 17, it's ODBC driver 17. Sorry, ODBC 17 for if you're on 2019. So things to consider, that's the driver that you want to use. So you'll have to download and install it. Oracle Net Client for Oracle, and these are the versions that are allowed. So that's something to consider. And then, of course, there's additional options for CMS and audit databases.
A question came in, how about Windows Server 2022?
Windows, oh, for operating system?
Yes.
Yeah, so again, I'm not sure, but I would imagine that's a knowledge-based article. I haven't looked at that one. But that's, if you look it up in the SAP support, you might find more latest support. They usually update the PAM guide within a certain amount of time, but the knowledge base will be updated earlier. So that's going to be if you don't see it in the PAM, which I looked this up maybe a week ago. So if you don't see it in the PAM, then check the knowledge base for latest versions. A lot of times in the knowledge base, they'll have tested some things, but not other things. And so they've certified certain things, and until they get through all of their testing, they won't release it to the PAM guide. All right, so .NET versions may have increased for your version that you were using in the past. So those are things to consider. SAP GUI, Apache versions, Microsoft Office. Note that this 365 cloud is working, it works, but it's not necessarily supported in terms of SAP support. Microsoft Office 64 is certified for LiveOffice. Other things in the PAM guide that you might be interested if you're using VMs, you want to check the version for those VMs. And then a big one for a lot of people is that, and I think this is a nice feature they've added into the PAM, is that the cloud servers, if you're jumping to AWS or Azure, you've got links, and there's more. But anyway, it gives you the link to the guide that is like the official guide. I've noticed that there's a couple of extra guides that are good to do, and there's blogs that are better, that are good guides as well. But in terms of direct from SAP, these are the knowledge base articles specific to the various cloud server installs. So these are good for if you're planning on that. Okay, so OLAP, of course, supported for the various versions may have increased. And then there's a specific knowledge base guide for dealing with SAP index queries and so forth. There's a lot of new data sources, and there's a lot associated with setting them up. So as far as connecting to them, so there's some additional files and steps to do as far as security goes to, for instance, access Google Drive or something like that. So there's, so anyway, I just kind of noted out some of the ones that people sometimes ask about. Definitely a lot of clients are moving to Snowflake. I haven't seen a lot of the Google BigQuery, but we have got questions about it. So note that there are knowledge base articles specific for that. But Snowflake, we've been doing a lot with, and we've got key pairs set up, and we've got a lot of experience there now. So anyway, there's a lot of versions that are new. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the browser updates. So one of the things, if you're doing SSO, Edge and Chrome have increased some of their requirements, and you'll need to do for SSO for Edge and Chrome, you'll need to do constrained delegated admin. So not just a delegated admin on the service account, but actually constrained. So there's some knowledge base articles specifically to that, specific to that. So that's something you want to consider. So your service account changing, imagine if you're trying to upgrade in place. So those are kinds of things that you want to consider. It's much easier, of course, if you're migrating over, especially if you're upgrading your operating system or something like that, you might as well. But it's nice to migrate as opposed to upgrade in place when you've got these kinds of low-level changes that are required. New requirements for SSL. If you're setting up a CSR for a key store, you need a SAN defined. Otherwise, you'll get an error message associated with that on Edge and Chrome. So those are now important to define. Custom web apps may need work with new requirements for cores. We had one client, it took a while for them, it wasn't just a matter of moving over libraries. There were some additional like XML files that needed to contain the information from the trusted authentication and so forth. So there's some more information on that SAP has been helpful on, but they've added a few documents in their installation. And they're specific to dealing with cores between custom web apps and your environment. Firefox, again, just noting it here because it is a browser. AWS or Azure cloud move, things to think about. This is the biggest one. Obviously, adding a layer of cloud, you have a layer of firewall. So Azure and et cetera have their own firewall. So it's a good idea to set, this has been a good idea for a long time. So this isn't anything new, but definitely when it comes to moving to the cloud, it becomes more important because you just have that extra layer of security and call out for your ports. So you want to set your different services to have a specific request port. And you can do that for the CMS. If you've got a split install, like a web install and an SIA, you can set the CMS request port in the command line in the SIA, so you can specify a port. So you don't have to open up all the ports in order to connect and then go into the browser and set it. So you can do that on the command line. If you need any help with that, let me know. Need to use the fully qualified domain name for most of the situation. So this becomes even more important. A lot of times, if you're internal, you can get away with just the domain name, but if you've got, Now with Azure, you need the actually fully qualified domain name, for example. Special settings defined for cloud type. That was just noting back to the PAM to look up the special settings specific to the cloud type you're moving to be different for AWS versus Azure, for example. We've noticed that the key pair for Snowflake, when we've done that, that a private key is needed for the server setting, whereas you can have the public key out to the users, but you can't have the public key on the server. I don't think that's in stone. I think that's just something that seemed to work. So just to note it. Azure Gateway used for load balancer. So that's just a specific call out to a project with Azure where we're not using, a general gateway. We're using the Azure Gateway. So that has a few different entries, but it's the same. You need to look at timeouts. You need to look at sticky sessions and all that. Plan for additional time. When you're moving to the cloud, just plan for additional time to work through connectivity issues. It seems like every site that I go to, we're working with a team of people, and sometimes we're working with multiple teams of people that don't talk to each other. So it's just one of those things that seems to add a little bit of time, just because we're all kind of not as used to it as we are some of the other things that we're working with. So I get it, but it seems to be communication across teams is increased when you're moving to the cloud, so plan for it. Set IP addresses, especially for SAML integration, but just in general with cloud, you want to have a set IP address and not a dynamic one. So a lot of people are moving into the multi-factor authentication. Both OAuth is supported now for SP2, and there's SAML that I've been working with, setting up SAML files that we then send over to the IDP, and they handle the authentication, and then the secret between them is shared and the person gets in. So that's the idea. Of course, the secret being shared means that they have to be enterprise accounts with trusted authentication turned on. So there's setup for that, and there is a specific setup for there's a setup for 4.3, and then there's another knowledge base article for SP02 that just adds a couple of settings, but they're important. So look for the second one when you're getting, or an additional one when that's specific to SP02 for SAML. Also, when you move to 4.3, of course, just like you did when you move to 4, they're requiring new license keys. So you need to request a new license key from SAP when you're going to 4.3. So again, one of those things that you would do ahead of time. Oh, that's not the line that I read out licenses and then I didn't read the whole thing. This is actually referring to that your IDP may, of course, be user by user licensing. So you may have to increase the number of licensing if you then send over authentication to your IDP. So that would be a consideration, is that might increase cost. Of course, the thought on that is that you might consider, I'm just going to move forward, but you might consider a push-pull model for users instead. So to avoid some of that extra licensing from your IDP server, you might consider some of the users that are not actively using BusinessObjects, just wanting the data exported to them. You can push that data out. So consider going to a push model for some users, and I put a question mark. It's completely dependent on your environment, but one of the things you might avoid is those IDP licenses. Of course, with Infoburst, we can do push model better than anybody. So anyway, developer user web intelligence training. This is a big thing to consider as far as your user perspective, because it's a whole new shebang. And of course, transition training from somebody who already knows web intelligence is going to be it's going to be helpful for them to do a transition training versus an all from the beginning. But even so, doing it all from the beginning is helpful because it's so different. So we do offer both, but it's definitely something to consider to do the whole thing because it is just very different. Fiori touchscreen capable. that something you might want to use, something to consider? Dashboard, big screen, new options. Again, there's, you know, this concept of using business objects in different ways. They've really pushed out the whole dashboarding. So you could have a big screen in the lobby that has, you know, a big dashboard that on it. And it's, you know, goes all the way out to the corners, and they have things like auto refresh timers. So it's got the latest data. So they really pushed into this world. And of course, Need for Viz also helps with some of the dashboarding with business objects. So things to consider from a user perspective, maybe they want to use that. Maybe some departments would be considering that. Not just merge data, but data from another Webby documents now available. Another thing to consider from a user perspective of how you might use that. We have some examples that we're going to bring to IBIS. User perspective, better security. There's multiple data logins with enhanced credential mappings. So that's a kind of a neat, an interesting thing, again, that might affect how the users interact with, especially developers, with the environment. More blogs here, so some information about that in the last few years. Some common silly issues if Windows Defender appears to be blocking the app when you go through the install. You can just turn that off. So if you turn it off at a time, I haven't seen it show up in any of the prerequisite things, and it seems to be something that you can turn off afterwards, but it's that you won't even deal with it if you turn it off beforehand when you install. So I think this is only, of course, on a Windows server. Also, seems I've come across this a couple of times, and it's just a matter of replacing the file. But if you're upgrading from 4.2 to 4.3, or doing an upgrade with 4.3, then you're from an earlier version of 4.3, either one, you might get this line that's happened before business objects for some reason on upgrades, but this seems to be one that's happening with the 4.3 environments, and it's just a matter of copying and pasting a DLL, so it's not a big deal to fix. And then part 2 is going to be a little bit of some of the changes and some more information about Workflow Assistant, and we're going to talk about some of the other things that are data source references and some of the other things that are specific from an administrator standpoint in part 2. And that's it. Are there any questions?
Hey, Amy, I think you answered all the questions so far. I think, what a lot of people are asking about these days is that, I'm on 4.2, SP6, SP7, SP8, SP9. How big of a deal is it for me to do that upgrade, and SAP has kind of stated, well, if you really wanted to, you could do an in-place upgrade, if you're on one of the more current 4.2 releases. But like you pointed out at the beginning, a lot of people are also taking advantage of going from 4.2 to 4.3 to clean some things up and get underlying operating systems changed and databases and browsers and so forth. And so with other changing parts, they tend to want to put it on, on new VMs, new servers. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely like the idea of an easier transition to a second environment on a new operating system, an upgraded operating system. You can upgrade your client tools. You can do all these extra things that put you in a better position for business objects, and it's not that big of a difference. And you're saving yourself the headache of potentially going to live on a new version and having some issue that you hadn't tested. I mean, that's always one of those things that you want to avoid. And from a user perspective, you don't want them to experience anything bad. And so it's always nicer for a go live to be a switch, the DNS. Boom. Yeah. Much easier, and worth it with all the things that you're getting. So,
yeah. We have one client here who just pointed out, Michael Davis, that he's installed a 4.3 SP2 and his Fiori layer is a lot, and the new Fiori layer seems to be a lot slower.
I'm noticing the same. Certainly on your new install, you want to, and in general, you want to increase the Java heap for Tomcat. So that would be your first thing, to just make sure you're maximizing, what your web server can handle for memory on that Java heap. Not using the default, which is 4096. So you want to increase that at least to 10, and it's and I would say, well, at least to 8, and then I would say 10 or 12 on just even an average site. Yeah, most people have it on a 16 gig server, memory server, so 12 still leaves you lots of room for paging and all that. So I think it's a good idea to make sure that is set, but I've still noticed it to seem to require more. I'm with you on that. I don't have an answer for it, but yeah, I've seen the same.
Well, I'd like to just interject there. I mean, 16 gig doesn't seem very big for 4.3 these days. I mean, would you, minimum...
Well, I'm talking about the web server, honestly.
Okay, just the web server.
No, I mean, absolutely not on an application. Yeah.
All right, so just the web server piece. Got it.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that's a good thing to clarify, because on the application we're starting at 48 and encouraging 64 and more. So yeah.
Right. Another question came in. Not sure if this falls in scope, but do we necessarily need to use the theme designer to get the company logo customized to our own company logo? I suppose that's on the Launchpad, the new Launchpad.
Do you necessarily? It's an easy thing to use, and it is one file that you can, replace in the WAR files and, have it update with everything else. So it's not. I'm not sure why you wouldn't want to. I've definitely seen in the past the ability to, to go into the jar files that are under the hood. We did that for the CMS. To put the logo on the CMS, for example, or to put little information on the CMS login screen. So, you can go into the jar files and do some custom editing, but that's not supported, if you're changing what's under the hood. But I would support using the theme designer. I'm not sure why you wouldn't want to, but I'm interested in hearing.
Right. Can you please tell us what's new in scheduling reports, and is it necessary to reschedule them after the upgrade?
I haven't had to reschedule them. Years back, there was a problem with a certain service pack where they had switched the extension for Crystal Reports to WID. So of course, Crystal Reports didn't schedule. Yeah, so it's definitely something you want to test, and you want to test both previously created schedules as well as newly created schedules, given my experience with that, that happening once. So, but I haven't had to reschedule anything. In fact, we've got, so far, the ones that I've done we haven't had to reschedule anything. We've had to turn the schedules back on. Oops.
Yeah, someone interjected that document schedules using Excel as the output format will need to be rescheduled.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Well, really? I'll have to look at that. That's not the experience, but it might have been that I was working with Infoverse for our output for stuff. So I haven't, I may not have come across that yet. That's interesting. I'll have to look at that. Right. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up.
More coming in.
Okay.
I might be able to take on some of these. Does 4.3 still support both Crystal Reports and CR4E? The answer is yes.
Yep.
It
Windows.
does.
Windows.
Yeah, Windows. The big thing there is the SAP is not going to support Crystal on Linux any longer, or on the Linux platform. So when you move to 4.3, you have to, if you're not already running Crystal on Windows. What would the consequences be of moving to 4.3 next year rather than this year? Is the reduced support offered likely to be good enough for a period? The answer is yes, it would be. You can move next year. It's priority one support simply means that they will still take calls on the product, on the software, and still provide fixes if they are known fixes, but they will not develop new patches, new fix packs, new service packs, and so forth. So, the answer, if the problem cannot be solved within the existing release, will be to move to the new release. But I would say that of the customers I've spoken to so far this year, about half of them are planning to move in 2022, the second half of 2022, and about half are planning to move in 2023. So I don't see an issue there. Okay.
Yeah, the main
Okay.
thing, the concern for, that if something did happen that needed a hot fix, you wouldn't get a hot fix.
Right. Do users have to reschedule the recurring scheduled documents after the upgrade?
No, not to my experience. It sounds like somebody had referred to output as Excel, though, destination as Excel, or not format as Excel. So maybe there's an issue there. I haven't experienced it, but a lot of times I'm working with InfoBurst customers. So yeah,
Right.
may not.
And going back to that original question about the logo, the reason for the question was that it seems that I would need to redeploy the BOE directory for my logo to take, and then would need to reconfigure the BOE level configurations. Example, SAML.
So you can, most of the things, depending on what you have, you can put back into the WAR files, and you can do that up front and not have to, not most, but many. I'd still say most. And then when you do a redeploy of your web app, it will redeploy those. So if you put them in their WAR files, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly. If you're in this situation where you're now running in production and you're wanting to make this change, and you see from the knowledge base article that you have to redeploy, I've worked with just changing the work file. I wouldn't say that that's highly recommended, but I have worked with just changing the work file in Tomcat for many things, and I think I did it with Theme Designer. I'd have to remember, but because usually I'm not in a production situation, I'm prior to that. But yeah, so that's something to look at, and you might be able to just make the change in the work file, and then it's just a restart of Tomcat as opposed to a redeploy.
Okay. Another question just came in, but I'm not quite sure what it means. What is the best way to migrate the data during the upgrade?
Best way to migrate the data. Oh, yeah. So Promotion Manager Wizard works great, in my opinion. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. I've done huge environments in a one push. I mean, I don't do that usually. Usually I do it in partials, but I mean, it's possible to do, and I've had good results. Promotion Manager Wizard, of course, you want to change the INI file to increase the amount of memory that you're allocating to it to run. And you also want to maybe set the TS time setting so that it's so that you're getting the same date modified time instead of a new date modified time when you migrate the documents. So look at the Promotion Manager Wizard INI. It's in the Win64 directory. But other than that, I just usually make sure that there's enough memory and that the temp folder has enough space, and migrating with the Promotion Manager Wizard works great. It also has a update time, where you can set anything that's newer than this date is, it filters for that. So it has a time filter on it. So you can also do multiple updates over time. Yeah.
Yeah, the user said they hadn't had much luck with that in the past, but they'll try again. Is there
It's
a K,
better.
is
Yeah,
there
it's
is there a KB that gives all the setting info?
that you'd find in the admin guide. I'm sure there is. I mean, there's definitely a master. There's a promotion manager wizard master KBA, but that's, you know, usually a master list of all the knowledge-based articles associated with, you know, steps people had problems with as opposed to the settings. But there's, I know that we've done a promotion manager presentation, one of our Speak BOs, and we would have pointed it out then. For the settings, but if you just go to the INI, you'll see the settings that are there. Look for a TS time and look for there's a Java heap setting. Those are the two biggies. And then just point the temp folder location to some place that's going to have enough space.
Okay. Should we expect the documents with custom SQL still to be kept with after the upgrade?
I would think so. I haven't tested that. I haven't had any custom SQL, have I? Actually, I think I have. And well, it was customized, not custom SQL in terms of freehand SQL. It was customized. I did have a, you know, query panel SQL customized. But I don't know that I've tested a freehand SQL. I would think it would, but there's no reason why it shouldn't. It's pointing to a connection object that's existing in your environment. So it should still work, but I haven't tested that.
Another comment that came in was, I believe linked universes have been brought back in 4.2 with some limitations. Are those limitations lifted in 4.3?
Remembering. I think that's ironed out in SPO2. I need to double check all that. I haven't looked at that in a while and I don't have it stuck in my memory, but I think that's the case. But yeah, don't take my word for it because I'm not 100% sure. So yeah, let's get me your name and I'll see and I'll find out.
Okay, staying on the subject of universes, when would it be better to when would it be better to rebuild the data foundation of a universe from scratch instead of converting it from IDT to UDT? Converting it to IDT from UDT, that should say.
Well, build it for scratch if your database is completely changed, if you've redesigned your database. But other than that, there is, of course, the multi-source versus single source issue that's in the new version. So multi-source is no longer being supported. I didn't mention that, but that is one of the items for support. So so if you're on multi-source IDT versions, then you need to redo for a single source. But you're talking about UDT to IDT. I would usually start the way we do that usually is we do the conversion and then we go through and we do testing and we look for things like especially dates. Date objects sometimes need to be date timed or back to date depending on the kind of type it is. Things like decimals we've had issues with during a UDT to IDT upgrade because now it allows more decimals where it used to only go to a certain point. So, you know, that can, if you're not handling that at the report end, then you could be seeing way more decimals than you wanted. So it's a good thing, but it's a bad thing in terms of consistency. So we've seen that, but I would usually start out with a conversion because you're gaining so much that you've already put into it, and then I would do testing.
Right. And I can answer the other. UDT is still supported in 4.3, we presume. Yes, the answer is yes, it is. It will continue to be supported till at least the end of 2024. It's just like Priority 1 support, there's not going to be any patches or fixes or any further updates to UMV universes. So I think we got to the end of the questions there. That will teach you, Amy, to put all those question marks on your last slide. I think that that compelled people to ask questions, because they see just a Budget question marks.
Well,
there.
I'm happy to answer them if I can. There's, it's definitely upgrade season. So, by IBIS, we'll have a lot more of information that should be very detailed in terms of things like that scheduling, testing to Excel. But, we're in testing mode on a lot of our upgrades right now that we're doing. And it does seem like that's getting more and more. We're getting more and more upgrades
Yes,
in the
excellent.
chute.
Excellent, good. And another good reason to come to IBIS to learn more about first-hand experiences of customers who've already done the upgrade. Okay, over to you, Lucy.